This video will explain the graphs showing aviation's effectiveness at preserving the resources of time, health, energy, safety, and security. On the AER website, you'll see graphs that look like this. When it says percent of resources preserved by aviation but wasted by surface transport, what does that mean? And what do these numbers out here tell us? In the AER, time, health, energy, safety, and security are considered to be resources. Resources that can either be used on transport or on people's work. The fewer resources someone spends on transport, the more resources they'll have available for their work. Let's start with time. For example, let's say there's a missionary who's going to travel from a town to the village where she works. If she flies, it'll take her 1 hour. If she goes by river, it'll take her 10 hours. Since aviation will get her there in less time than any other mode of transport, she has to expend at least 1 hour traveling. Therefore, that 1 hour is well used. This means if aviation were available, it would not be necessary for her to expend the additional 9 hours. In other words, those 9 hours would be wasted. 1 hour is 10% of 10 hours. Therefore, when traveling by river, 10% of her time is well used, and the other 90%, the 9 hours, is wasted. Aviation preserves the 90% that's wasted by the river trip. The same concepts apply to health, energy, safety, and security. Quantifying the amount of time and energy used when traveling was fairly easy, because we can measure time and because we're used to thinking in terms of how much energy we have. However, quantifying the amounts of health, safety, and security was more difficult, because we don't normally think of these in terms of amounts. Rather, we think of them in terms of the probabilities of something happening. For example, the probability of getting injured or the chances of something being stolen. And because there are no commonly agreed standards by which to actually measure the amounts of health, safety, and security preserved, it was not practical to write survey questions to obtain amounts of these resources. Therefore, it was necessary to use probabilities as substitutes for amounts. For example, if a respondent said there was a 50% probability of them getting injured when traveling by river, it was considered as 50% of their resource of safety being used. Okay, so let's continue with that example and take a look at safety. Again, the missionary is going to travel from a town to the village where she works. When she starts out in the morning, she has 100% of her safety. That is, she's totally safe, she isn't injured, she doesn't need medical care, and therefore she's fully able to do her work. Today, she's going to go to the village by river, but next month, she's going to fly. During both trips, there's some probability or chance she'll get injured. In the interview, she indicated when going by river, the probability of getting physically injured is 50%, or, put in the terms of the research, 50% of her resource of safety would be used. When she flies to the village, she said the probability of getting injured is 5%. In other words, that 5% of her resource of safety would be used. Now, because aviation preserves resources better than any other mode, the missionary will have to use a minimum of 5% of her resource of safety during her trip to the village. She has to use that amount regardless of whether she goes by river or by air. That tells us that 5% of the 50% used by river is well used. The question then becomes, 5 is what portion of 50? Well, 5 is 10% of 50. Therefore, 10% of the resource is well used, because it has to be expended regardless of the mode, and the other 90% is wasted, because if aviation were available, it would not be necessary to expend this amount of the resource. The 90% wasted by surface transport is preserved by aviation and is available to advance the missionary's work. Okay, let's move from our example to the actual graph showing the amount of safety for people preserved by aviation. We see in the river context that the 83% of safety wasted by surface transport was preserved by aviation. And you can see aviation preserved a very large percentage of people's safety in the other transportation contexts as well. Quantifying the amounts of time, health, energy, safety, and security preserved by aviation enables us to make more knowledgeable decisions about when, where, and for whom to use or not use aviation worldwide.